They raised the white flag for peace and then opened fire. This wasn't war, it was extermination wearing a handshake. Welcome back to the Modoc War series, where we uncover the forgotten rebellion of a small native tribe who defied the United States Army. Not for glory, not for conquest, but simply to go home. I'm glad you're here with me today because this story starts long before the first shot was fired, and what it reveals might change how you think about trust, promises, and survival. Imagine losing everything, your land, your language, your dignity, and then being told to be grateful for what remains. That's where this story begins. In the far north of California near Tule Lake, in a time before treaties, before flags, and before the lie of peace. The Modoc people lived there not just for decades, not even just centuries, but for thousands of years. They fished in the rivers, dug into the soil for lily seeds and acorns, built homes that held in heat through the bitter winters. They didn't need borders or reservations or bureaucracy. They had what every civilization once dreamed of: balance and belonging. When outsiders first came, it wasn't war, it was trade. Metal pots, mirrors, horses' knives. But as always, the gifts came with a price that wasn't on the table. What came next wasn't recorded on parchment, but carved into bone and memory. Slowly, the faces of the visitors changed. So did their intent. And when the first gunfire echoed through the hills, no one knew that it would echo for generations. This is not just a story of warriors. It's a story of a man named Captain Jack who tried to live like the white men, dressed like them, spoke like them, even said, "I consider myself a white man." But they never saw him as one. This is a story of what happens when your very existence becomes inconvenient to an empire that never learned to listen before it drew its maps and loaded its rifles. So, today, let's go back to where it all began. Not with blood, but with betrayal. Not with bullets, but with the promise that was never meant to be kept. Because sometimes peace is not the absence of war, it's just the silence before it. Before the maps and the flags and the rifles, there was land that breathed quietly beneath the sky. The Modoc people did not build empires or cities, they built harmony. Their world stretched across 5,000 square miles from the volcanic plateaus of southern Oregon to the rich valleys of northern California. Tule Lake shimmered at the center of it all, its waters teeming with fish, its shores wrapped in wild grasses, reeds, and ancient trees. Here, every season gave something. The winters were long, but the people knew how to live inside them. They built earth-covered lodges and pit houses, sometimes dug 15 feet deep into the soil to hold the warmth. In spring, they gathered acorns, ground lily seeds into meal, and watched the sky for the birds that always returned. In summer, they traveled, traded, laughed, and married. In fall, they stored what they could because they knew the cold would come again. But they never feared it. They understood it. That's what home meant. The Modoc were not many, just 400, maybe 500 at the height of their numbers. But they didn't need more, because the land provided, and they provided for each other. Elders told stories of fire that once rose from the ground of the day. Mount Mazama erupted, tearing the sky, and forming what would later be called Crater Lake. They remembered, not through writing, but through speaking, through songs, through stillness. They had no need for conquest because they had belonging. But peace like that does not impress those who come looking for ownership. To them, land without fences looks like land waiting to be taken. The first white men who came were fur traders. They came with muskets, but they came with smiles too. They bartered knives, iron tools, blankets, and horses. The Modoc traded fish hides and friendship. For a while it worked, but the nature of trade is that someone always wants more. When the trappers left, soldiers came. When the soldiers came, the rules changed. And suddenly the Modoc way of life looked primitive to those who couldn't survive a single winter without shelter made by another man's hands. It's easy to judge a people when you don't know what they've survived. And the Modoc had survived everything, weather, hunger, isolation, but they were not prepared for what was coming. Not because they were weak, but because they trusted too long. Because peace was something they lived, not something they negotiated under duress. The first lesson they were forced to learn was this. When someone comes into your home and calls it opportunity, they are not your guest. They are your replacement. And once that thought enters the room, peace starts walking out the door. The first deals were simple. A knife for a pelt, a mirror for dried fish, a wool blanket for trust. But trade has a way of shifting. What begins as barter becomes expectation. Then comes dependency. Then debt. And finally control. The Modoc had never needed money. They measured wealth in community and skill in survival. But the newcomers brought a different language, not just of words, but of value. They gave tools with one hand and drew maps with the other. They talked of friendship while carving roads straight through ancient hunting trails. Around 1827, Peter Ogden passed through a fur trader whose route weaved through both Klamath and Modoc lands. He dealt mainly with the Klamath traditional enemies of the Modoc, but his presence signaled a new chapter. He was soon followed by more traders, and behind the traders came settlers, and behind the settlers came soldiers, and behind the soldiers came laws. Not laws written with fairness, but laws written to justify the presence of the men holding the pens. In 1846, the expedition of John C. Fremont entered the region. Guided by Kit Carson, they claimed to be exploring. But exploration, when done at the barrel of a rifle, looks a lot like invasion. After losing 3 men in the night, Fremont and his party attacked a nearby Klamath fishing village at dawn. They killed 21 people, many still half asleep. And as they moved south, they killed every native they saw. Some say the Modoc were the ones who had attacked Fremont's camp first. Others say the Modoc only watched, but the facts didn't matter. What mattered was who had the power to write the story. Just a month before this massacre, Fremont's men had already slaughtered dozens at a Wintu encampment based on rumors of a possible attack. Kit Carson called it a perfect butchery. The message was clear. You didn't need to do anything wrong to be killed. You only needed to exist in the wrong place at the wrong time. For the Modoc, the wrong place was their own homeland, and the wrong time was always. These weren't random acts of violence. They were patterns. Organized, systemic, and justified by the language of fear. By the early 1850s, settlers referred to Tool Lake as Bloody Point. Stories spread of wagon trains being attacked, of children kidnapped, of entire families wiped out. The numbers were inflated. One report claimed over 60 settlers were killed in a single incident. But more accurate records suggest a total closer to 36, spread out over many smaller encounters. Still, fear doesn't need accuracy to grow, and once fear takes root, it spreads like wildfire, giving birth to policies made in panic and vengeance. The arrival of Benjamin Wright in 1847 turned fear into business. He was not a general. He was not a governor. He was something more dangerous, A man who learned that violence against native people could be profitable. California offered $5 for every native head, 25 cents for a scalp. Wright built a career collecting these bounties. He didn't see people. He saw currency. He once attacked a Modoc village at dawn, killing more than a dozen. Later, he killed another 15 in a nearby camp. When settlers complained of stolen horses possibly taken by another tribe, Wright made no distinction. To him, a dead Modoc was always the right answer. He even turned peace into a trap. He invited Modoc leaders to parley. They came under a flag of truce. He served them food possibly laced with strychnine. When the poison failed, he and his men opened fire. The Modoc were unarmed. It was a slaughter. Some say 30 died, others say 90. Not one of Wright's men fell. Among the dead, it was whispered was the father of a young boy who would grow up to be known as Captain Jack. What lesson does a child learn from watching his people murdered under the illusion of peace? What story does he tell himself when white men are praised for kindness while carrying rifles behind their backs? The story he learns is this: trust is the first thing they take from you and the last thing they use against you. And from that moment on, every handshake carries a shadow of a gun. The blood didn't just soak the soil, it fed the system. In California, genocide wasn't just tolerated, it was subsidized. The state passed legislation to reimburse militia groups for the removal of native populations. Newspapers printed casualty lists like hunting trophies. Local governments offered payments for scalps, severed heads, even fingers. The logic was chilling in its efficiency. If the federal government was too slow to remove the tribes, the state would handle it faster and deadlier. Governor Peter Burnett, California's first governor, didn't hide the truth. In 1851, he declared that a war of extermination would continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race became extinct. He said this publicly on record as policy. The same government that spoke of civilization, of treaties of order, now put a bounty on human lives and called it justice. Over the next 2 decades, California spent over $1.5 million, nearly $60 million in today's terms, on local militias whose primary job was to kill. And they did, with impunity. They raided villages, shot unarmed elders, raped and enslaved women, and paraded their victims as trophies. And through all this, the Modoc survived. They buried their dead, tended their wounded, and moved when the killing got too close. But the memories followed. Captain Jack grew up in a world where every white handshake could end in blood, where every promise came with a knife behind the back. He was a boy when the Ben Wright massacre happened. By the time he became a man, he had already learned the cruel calculus of survival trust. Slowly arm, always. In 1864, the United States proposed a treaty. It offered the Modoc protection, food money, and a place to live in return for surrendering their ancestral lands. The land in question wasn't just where they had lived. It was where their ancestors were buried, where their children were born, where their stories were written in the wind and the stones. But hunger is persuasive. After years of being hunted and starved, the Modoc agreed. But there was a catch. The new reservation would be shared with the Klamath tribe, their traditional enemies. The Klamath outnumbered them, controlled the politics, and viewed the Modoc with contempt. The government officials knew this. They also knew the land offered was colder, harsher, and less abundant than Tull Lake. Still, they promised protection, regular annuities, and one-time payments in gold. At first, the Modoc waited. Then they asked. Then they begged. But the gold never came. The supply stopped after a year. The food was often rotten. The Klamath controlled the distribution. Abuse and humiliation became daily routine. Captain Jack pleaded with government agents. He asked for his people to be allowed a small reservation of their own just a few miles of their old homeland. A place to live without fear, without rivalry. They said no. Not now. Maybe later. But later never came. Starving, sick, and tired of broken promises, Jack made a decision. In 1870, he led his band 50 warriors, their wives, their children away from the reservation and back to the Lost River. They didn't sneak. They didn't hide. They built shelters, fished the rivers, and lived as their ancestors had done. Some found jobs in the nearby white settlements. Others traded peacefully with the townsfolk. Captain Jack wore settler clothes. He shook settler hands. He said again and again he wanted peace. "I consider myself a white man," he once said. Not because he rejected his people, but because he thought peace meant becoming what they wanted. But peace isn't just what you offer. It's what you're willing to accept from others. And the settlers did not accept Jack's independence. Indian agents pressured him to return to the Klamath reservation. They promised things would be better. He refused. They warned him. He still refused. They filed complaints. They said the Modoc were insolent, that they walked into cabins without asking, demanded food, smoked by the fire like they owned the place. Jack, for his part, believed his people had a right to be there. After all, this was still Modoc land. Always had been. He even charged fees to settlers who let their livestock graze on Modoc territory. To Jack, this was fairness. To the settlers, it was insubordination. And then came the final blow. Jack's own child fell sick. He asked the tribal shaman to heal him. When the child died, Jack killed the shaman. Under Modoc law, a healer is held responsible if they fail. It's not about revenge, it's about cosmic balance. But under American law, it was murder. A warrant was issued for Captain Jack's arrest. Officials now had a legal excuse to act. Still, they waited. The priority was not justice, it was control. And by 1872, the call came from Agent Thomas Odell. He said the time for words had ended. The Modoc were to be returned by any means necessary. He sent a message to Fort Klamath, and the soldiers began to march. Captain James Jackson led 35 cavalry troopers from Fort Klamath. With them came a dozen civilian volunteers, most of them settlers from nearby Linkville, now known as Klamath Falls. Some had been drinking the night before, emboldened not by discipline but by anger and alcohol. Their orders on paper were clear. Attempt peaceful resolution. Fire no gun unless in self-defense. But orders written in ink are often drowned out by emotions boiling in blood. The Modoc had 2 camps on the Lost River. Captain Jack's main group lived to the west along the riverbanks. A second band led by Hooker Jim and Scarface Charlie camped on the eastern side. When the soldiers arrived on the cold morning of November 29th, the sun had barely risen. The fog clung low to the ground. The soil was frozen, but the air burned with tension. Scarface. Charlie was the first to see them. He fired his gun, not as an attack, but as a signal. Captain Jack was inside his lodge, not preparing for battle, but expecting another talk, another negotiation, another empty promise. But there was no negotiation this time. The soldiers deployed into lines. They moved quickly. Civilian volunteers, already agitated, began shouting. The Modoc warriors responded with instinct. They stripped off heavy clothing for mobility. Women and children dropped to the ground, clutching one another. The army interpreter, a relative of the Applegate family who had helped blaze the trail that ran through Modoc lands, sensed something was wrong. He spurred his horse and rode away, yelling that the Modoc were going to attack. He was wrong, but his panic became prophecy. Captain Jackson gave an order. Lieutenant Fraser Boutelle was to move forward, disarm Scarface Charlie, and place him under arrest. Boutelle advanced. Charlie refused to surrender. The two men stood only feet apart, tense, breathing hard. Each drew a revolver. They fired. Charlie's bullet passed through Boutelle's sleeve. Boutelle's shot tore the feathers from Charlie's headband. Both missed, but in that moment, the first shots of the Modoc War were fired, and there was no turning back. Gunfire erupted. Modoc warriors unleashed arrows and bullets. Soldiers scattered, scrambling to find cover, slipping on frozen ground. At Hooker Jim's camp across the river, the armed civilians tried to seize weapons. Some Modoc laid theirs down, others hesitated. Then the firing started. One shotgun blast hit an unarmed woman and her infant child. Both died instantly. Chaos swallowed reason. In less than 5 minutes, 2 civilians and 1 soldier were dead. A Modoc warrior called the Watchman fell alongside them. Several were wounded. The soldiers, disoriented, cold, and uncoordinated, began to retreat. Boutelle rallied a few to countercharge, momentarily pushing the Modoc back. But it was too late. The Modoc pulled away, fleeing their now burning lodges. The troops set fire to the shelters, destroyed stored food, and scattered their belongings. One elderly woman, unable to flee, died in the flames. No one noticed her until it was over. The Lost River fight had ended, but the war had only just begun. Captain Jack and his people escaped south into the lava beds. They knew the terrain. They had lived among the caves and ridges for generations. The lava fields became their fortress. They called it Jack's Stronghold. It was not just a hiding place. It was a statement. They would not run anymore. They would fight here, on their land, for their right to live. For many of them, it was not about victory. It was about dignity, about dying on their own terms if that was the only thing left to choose. In that smoke, in that frozen air, something changed. The Modoc were no longer asking for peace. They were preparing for war. And in the weeks that followed, as the United States Army gathered men, guns, and cannons as headlines called for punishment, and as old debts of blood began to rise like ghosts from the soil, a different fire started burning. One not of wood or flame, but of memory, of betrayal, of everything promised and never delivered. Captain Jack had once said he considered himself a white man. But now, in the eyes of the Army and the state, he was something else entirely. An enemy. A rebel. And before long, they would call him something worse, a murderer. But they never called him what he truly was. A man who only wanted to go home. In the days following the battle at Lost River, confusion rippled through every corner of the region. Newspapers scrambled for details. Some called it an Indian uprising. Others reported it as a massacre of settlers. Few bothered to mention that it was the army that arrived first, that it was soldiers who marched in with loaded weapons, that the Modoc had not asked for any of it. Captain Jack's band, now scattered and shaken, moved south with haste. They carried wounded children, They carried the last of their blankets and the memories of another promise broken. But what they carried most was the weight of knowing no one would believe them. They passed through familiar terrain, sheltering in caves where their ancestors once waited out the snow. They lit small fires. They spoke in whispers. They made plans. But above all, they mourned. They mourned the woman who burned, the child who died in the blast, the peace that never really had a chance to begin. At Tool Lake, settlers began reinforcing their properties, anticipating attacks that hadn't been promised. Rumors spread like wildfire. That Captain Jack had hundreds of warriors, that he was planning revenge, that all natives were rising up. Fear turned into outrage. Outrage demanded retribution, and retribution called for war. Indian agents filed reports, politicians called for more troops, and the military began to treat the Modoc not as a small band trying to survive, but as a threat to be crushed. But back in the lava beds, the Modoc weren't preparing to conquer anything. They were preparing for siege. They fortified trenches between black rock walls. They stored what food they could. They counted bullets, made plans for defense, and waited. They weren't trying to win. They were trying not to lose everything. Again. What began as a cry for fairness had now become a standoff, and the quiet between both sides was not silence. It was tension stretching thinner and thinner with each day that passed. Captain Jack had always believed that peace was possible. But now, as smoke drifted from ruined lodges and scouts reported soldiers gathering by the hundreds, even he began to understand. The only thing more dangerous than a war you choose is the war that chooses you. The fire that burned the Modoc lodges may have gone out that morning, but something deeper had been lit in its place. A fire that smoldered beneath the volcanic rock, beneath the treaty papers, never honored beneath every name. They were never allowed to speak as equals. And while the soldiers retreated to regroup, and the settlers locked their doors a little tighter that night, the Modoc stood quietly in their caves, not with rage, but with resolve. They had not started this war, but they would no longer run from it. They had already lost their lands, their allies, their protections, and now they had lost the illusion that peace could be made by shaking the same hand that had signed away their homes. And yet, even in that betrayal, there was still dignity. Not in surrender, but in resistance. Not in vengeance, but in the refusal to disappear without being heard. And maybe that's the part of history we were never taught. That sometimes strength isn't about victory. It's about standing your ground when no one else believes you belong there at all. And maybe the real tragedy isn't that Captain Jack chose to fight, but that he was forced to believe that no other choice remained. We began this story not with blood, but with promises. And now we've watched those promises burn. Not because of who the Modoc were, but because of what others refused to let them be. People, neighbors, equals. And maybe that's what we carry with us today. Not just the facts of what happened, but the feelings of how easy it is to ignore a voice until it's raised in desperation, and how costly it becomes when understanding arrives. Too late. So as we close this first chapter in the story of the Modoc War, take with you this lesson: the deepest scars aren't always carved by bullets. Sometimes they come from silence, from broken words, and from the spaces between what we say and what we do. And if we ever hope to live in a world that values justice over conquest, we must remember that peace isn't made on paper. It's made in how we treat those who cannot force us to listen, but still deserve to be heard. Thank you for staying with me. through this first part of a story that history tried to forget, but memory refuses to bury. And if you thought this was the worst it could get, then you need to be here for what comes next. Because in the next episode, the soldiers return not with promises but with artillery, and what happens in the lava beds will make the Battle of Lost River look like a whisper. The ghosts will rise, the lava will echo, and a man who never wanted to be a general will become the only United States officer ever killed in the Indian Wars. You do not want to miss what happens when peace is offered again, and this time Captain Jack answers with something far deadlier than a bullet. I'll see you next time right here, where the truth lives, quietly waiting, in the cracks between the stories we think we know and the ones that still deserve to be told.